You're listening to Biotech Hangout, a live and unedited weekly discussion of all the latest news in our industry with a group of biotech insiders. I'm Grace Colón, and my co-hosts today are Eric Schmidt, John Maraganore, Paul Matteis, and Bruce Booth. For more information on our hosts and guest speakers, or to listen to the most recent episode, please go to biotechhangout.com. Once again this week, lots going on, especially on the policy side. So why don't we jump right in with one of the big, shocking, maybe not so shocking pieces this week, which was the cancellation by HHS of major BARDA projects related to mRNA vaccines, 22 projects and 500 million in total. John, I know you had some comments on this.
Should we start maybe with the other news and then on the MFN tariffs, Prasad, and then we'll go back to John on the BARDA stuff?
That's a great point. So why don't we jump to the other policy issue, which was a lot going on tariffs and MFN. After the initial announcement in May about MFN, that move was lambasted. There was a lot of warnings about what it would do to the industry. And the news continued. I mean, there was estimates that this would have a $1 trillion impact to the industry. Last year, there was a trade deal announced between the US and the EU, including a 15% tariff on pharma. But then this week, and of course, last week, there were the letters sent to top pharma and biotech companies about MFN. And then this week, President Trump said pharmaceutical tariffs will be announced as soon as next week and could reach up to 250% after the next year and a half. So, Paul, please help us understand all of this.
Sure. I mean, I think the short answer is that there's still a very, very wide range of potential outcomes here. I mean, I think we all know, like, if taken literally, right, taken 250% or taken to a scenario where companies have to just give Medicaid the lowest net price they get across a collection of countries, that, I mean, this is just objectively bad for the industry. And I think Eric would agree that, these worst case scenarios are nowhere near pricing to stocks, right? So I think but I think the flip side of this is that, if we learned anything from all of the other tariffs, is that what we have here still looks probably like it's negotiation tactics, and that this is a first offer that might be more draconian, and ultimately, pharma and biotech are going to have to give up something, but how much they're going to have to give up remains sort of, I think, open for debate, or open for us to see. I mean, as I sort of see the tariff piece, I think is the harder one to kind of value into companies. And I've been surprised by the number of companies I cover who say that tariffs would have very, very little impact on them, even companies that have key parts of their supply chain outside of the US. And, I'm not an accountant, but I have to believe that there are some really, really smart lawyers and accountants that are kind of working on ways that you can maybe play around with COGS or transfer price or things like that to kind of mitigate the impact. And I think that that's kind of what certain companies are alluding to. And so I guess what I'm trying to say is I feel like on the tariff side, just from talking to some of my companies, as an analyst, I guess I'm at least I face like maybe a little bit less worried about that, especially if the number comes closer to something that, like what we saw in this, EU deal, for example. On the MFN side, I mean, I think that is the far scarier thing here for the sector, but still a wide range of outcomes, right? And maybe this ends up like the IRA, where it's a few drugs at first. Maybe this ends up being for, newly launched drugs, which in some ways might actually have pros and cons, right? I mean, because and again, I'm thinking this purely from a pricing power perspective, not from a public health perspective. I think that's a separate topic. So purely from a stock perspective, right? I mean, I think there's a lot of ways this could play out here. And I guess I'm a little nervous because I don't feel like, this has been weighing on the XBI as much as it could be. I think a lot of people are just kind of almost jaded at this point to the Trump news cycle. And, again, wide range of outcomes. Would love other people's perspective.
I mean, I'll jump in. I generally agree with everything Paul said, and in particular, think that it's MFN and less so tariffs that are the industry's sore spot right now. On tariffs, we kind of got conflicting news. On the one hand, I think Trump was on CNBC and talked to Squawk Box about how he's really got pharma in his sights, and he's hoping potentially the tariffs could reach as high as 250%. But that's probably a lot of bluster. It's probably, you know, a way to leverage the pharmaceutical industry toward his goal of reducing drugs and maybe even, you know, having them play a little bit more on the MFN side. And I could totally agree with Paul. I think the accountants have already figured out how to game the system with regard to tariffs, such that they can import drugs at price points in their supply chain that are relatively modest and low, and therefore have relatively modest and low tariffs on those importations. And then subsequently either fill finish or do other things in the United States to maximize the sales price and the step up potential and get around those tariffs. But the other thing that happened this week was that Trump also suggested he could exempt some of the technology companies from tariffs. 100% of chip tariffs might be exempt, for example. So don't know quite what's going on there. And certainly I'm not a tech analyst, but I know some of my colleagues in pharma land have thought that, you know, maybe if chips and semiconductors can be exempt from some of this, pharma can get an exemption too. My strong suspicion is that would only happen if the industry maybe comes to the table a little bit more and strikes a deal on MFN. And, you know, we did hear from multiple large pharma companies that have reported earnings in the last week or two that they are having those types of negotiation discussions with the administration. So we'll just have to see where that lands.
Eric, should we talk about this Prasad news and the continued FDA saga? You kick it off,
That's
and
something else. Yeah. Okay. Well, I guess the other topic we had out of Washington this week was around the seemingly strange possibility that Dr. Prasad might make a comeback. This came from an HHS interview around the MAHA efforts to revolutionize healthcare. And I guess Dr. Makary was asked by someone from the audience, presumably someone in the press, whether Dr. Prasad had left under what kind of circumstances and what, you know, what the deal was there. And Dr. Makary quickly came to the defense of his friend, which was nice to see. And he suggested that Dr. Prasad was not at all pushed out, that it was Dr. Prasad's decision to leave the FDA and leave CBER. And that some of the other media reports we've seen around the MAHA efforts to move him aside might not be true. And then what I think really caught our attention, Paul, was that Dr. Makary went even further and said that he's in almost daily conversations with Dr. Prasad and has invited Dr. Prasad to come back to the agency and is trying to convince him to do just that. So, you know, that's the news from earlier in the week. I was honestly flabbergasted by the statement that, you know, there's an avenue back potentially for Dr. Prasad. I know that Dr. Makary and Prasad are good friends, and that I'm sure, you know, Dr. Makary feels the loss of his partner at the FDA. But, you know, for everyone's sake, I can't imagine that would be a good turn of events. But Paul, your thoughts?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think, like, you know, whatever you think of Dr. Prasad, right, given the controversy with him at the FDA, you know, internally with some of the stuff he had said about the FDA, and then externally, it feels like if he left because he was worried about, you know, himself as a distraction, I mean, that's the way it's been described, right? I mean, this would just create, I feel like, a much bigger distraction. And I feel like it just would be it'd be tough on any organization, right? To kind of you have this huge change in leadership and philosophy, and then you have one leave and then now come back. I mean, and then, you know, we're going to be kind of talking about, you know, companies now, and hey, when was your meeting with the FDA? Was it during the first tenure of Prasad or the second? Like, I just feel like it would be just make our jobs too complicated. And already I think it's hard, you know, as an analyst or an investor, to be right more than 50% of the time. You know, we were having a conversation internally like this week with one of my colleagues at Stifel, and just like whether, you know, Prasad really was that much more strict, you know, because I think like that had obviously been the narrative, right? That historically, with just everything he had said on social media, this guy's going to be so much tougher in industry. And then, you know, like you were talking about last week, Eric, right? We saw the ultragenic CRL, Replimune, and I'm forgetting what, Capricorn too. But I guess like I do still feel like the jury on what the Prasad CBER looked like was still sort of out, right? I mean, we had this article, and you're closer to Replimune than I am, Eric, around, you know, how maybe it wasn't Prasad at all who drove that CRL, you know, the Capricorn situation. I wonder if that was something that might have been pushing the FDA flexibility side, maybe farther than usual, right? Without opining as much on that company or stock, like, just that was, maybe a little bit less traditional of like a mechanism and a data set. And then with Ultragenyx, right, we had something related to manufacturing. So I actually still feel like, a lot of my companies in the rare and gene therapy space still felt like when Prasad was at the FDA, that their dialogue and, getting things like breakthrough or pivotal trial signups, like none of that had changed. And so, I guess, but I think if he came back, it feels like it would be such a big distraction. And, I think the hope is we get someone who's maybe a little bit more down the middle. But, I feel like it's kind of unpredictable. Like, I mean, we haven't seen any sort of short list of who his replacement could be.
Yeah, no, those are great points. I mean, I think what you're sort of anchoring around is, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, Paul, but it's hard to know whether, from a review standpoint, Dr. Prasad was good, bad, or indifferent. Did he really come down harder or easier on reviews? I don't know. I'm not sure we'll ever know. But I think one thing that we did see was a little bit more drama for sure, and a little bit more unpredictability in his 84 days at CBER. And it just seems to me that we need to kind of return to normalcy, right? We need almost like a little bit of a healing at the FDA and hopefully a stabilizing at the FDA. We've talked about how potentially Dr. Prasad and Dr. Makari are more externally oriented than internally oriented managers. But yeah, I do hope that whoever comes and takes his place, it sounds like George Tidmarsh for now is going to be filling in, at least temporarily, CBER's roles. I hope that person can bring more of an expertise in organizational leadership, some maybe a calming presence even. It seems like Dr. Tidmarsh might be just that person given his past. And yeah, I mean, we just need the review staff to do their job, right? This day and age where it comes down to a single personality, whether that's Dr. Prasad at CBER, or you alluded to the Replimune situation and some thoughts that, maybe ODAC leadership, sorry, the Oncology Drug Committee leadership was what relevant there.
Were you surprised by that? You're like a lot closer to the onc space than I.
Well, if the reports are true, and Stat News has done a great job here, I have no doubt, I have no reason to doubt that they're not true. Dr. Prasad was in all these discussions, right? So, and it is CBER that sent the review letter to Replimune, the CRL. So, everything I've seen about Dr. Prasad tells me he is someone who wants to grab the microphone or the pen and make decisions and not be a fly on the wall. So suggesting that Dr. Pazdur was the one who did that application, and honestly, that's probably semantics more than anything else. I think that Pazdur probably does have a view, and knowing what the Oncology Drug Division has done historically, probably quite consistent with Pazdur's views that they thought the trial design here may not have been optimal. But at the end of the day, this was done on Dr. Prasad's CBER watch. The Ken review was done by CBER. And I've got to think that if Dr. Prasad had wanted the drug approved, he would have done it. And if he didn't want the drug approved, he would have sent the CRL, which is obviously what happened.
Fair enough.
Your thoughts?
No, I mean, I'm not, I think that makes sense. Like and look, I don't doubt Stat either. I mean, Stat, I think, is my best. It's better than any expert network we could have right now on just what's actually going on at the FDA and on the policy side. But, like with anything, right? Like you never know who the source is or who's saying what and why. And, I just think, I think, again, the jury was still out, right, on what Prasad's CBER might have looked like. And I think probably, at least from a stock perspective, hopefully we don't get to rerun this hypothetical back twice, because it feels like that would be pretty destabilizing for the market.
So before we leave the FDA, Paul, I guess we ought to talk about some news either, from late last week on Regeneron, and then this week it bled into Scholar Rock. But in both cases, we've had some CRLs, one issued and maybe one in the future threatening to be issued around some manufacturing considerations. Are you close to those two?
Not really, but I guess from your perspective, how do we, as outsiders in these situations, when we see things like something related to like a CMC, or how do we actually get kind of a sense or a true gut check on whether or not the FDA is actually being more conservative. I mean, sometimes there's like these overt scenarios, but I always feel like with this kind of stuff, there's like so much level of like informational asymmetry, and it's like a little bit like who said what. But you cover Scholar Rock. Like, do you feel like there's actually something here that is eyebrow raising, and we should all be thinking about?
Well, yeah, so hard to have perfect visibility. And honestly, having spoken to Scholar Rock, they themselves at this stage, I don't think have particularly good visibility on how this is going to play out. For those of our listeners who are maybe less familiar, maybe we should take a step back here. The reason that Regeneron and Scholar Rock are connected is that both have programs under review that were being filled and finished. CMC programs are being filled and finished by a facility that used to be owned by Catalent and now is owned by Novo. This facility is based in Indianapolis. And that facility has been a troublesome facility for a long time. I think there are 483 letters going back now several years, observations that just seemingly have not been remedied. And as far as I understand it, one of the leverage points that the FDA has to force an owner to remedy a facility is by not approving new drugs through that facility. The Catalent now Novo facility, it can ship drugs and is shipping drugs on a regular day-to-day basis, and products are coming out of that facility and being sent to patients. The issues are not seemingly related to drug safety or drug purity or contamination issues. There are other issues, probably, a variety of other issues, but things that we don't fully understand and know about. So products are leaving the facility, but when it comes to approving a new drug that's being finished at this facility, the FDA is really able to throw down the hammer and is able to, force the owner of the facility to make corrections. And that's exactly the situation, unfortunately, that both Regeneron and Scholar Rock find themselves in. I feel for them because they're really kind of caught in the middle. They obviously don't own and control the facility, and they're to some extent completely dependent upon Novo to fix its issues. So we had a CRL issue to Regeneron, I guess 2 CRLs last week, and this week Scholar Rock made the very transparent statement to its investors that it may also have problems at the same facility. Yeah, good question, Paul. I don't think we understand how we can possibly calibrate the severity of this concern right now. The good news from Scholar Rock is their drug is seemingly approvable from a safety and efficacy standpoint. The drug obviously affects kids. These are patients with spinal muscular atrophy, very severe disease, and I would hope that the FDA might err on the side of providing access to a potentially game-saving drug for patients in great unmet need. So we're hopeful, but their PDUFA date isn't until September 22nd. Maybe there's time to remedy the situation or to have some kind of alternative process.
Interesting. Okay. Something to watch. Before we move on with like policy stuff and start talking about companies, do you want to just briefly talk about the BARDA topic that you proposed?
Yeah, I mean, look, I mean, I don't think anybody's surprised that our HHS secretary is not particularly enthusiastic about vaccines, and we don't have to go into the merits of that. Although I think most of us would agree that vaccines are critical. But I mean, the BARDA decision to basically cut the knees off of quite a bit of funding is really unfortunate because the mRNA platform is really something which I think everybody acknowledges was fundamental in helping us get out of the pandemic. And we're not done with pandemics or emerging threats, and even epidemics that could be could be challenging for society. And so to not need to invest in that platform as a rapid response mechanism through BARDA. Obviously, there are companies that independently do work in the space, but BARDA should be active in terms of the public health funding aspects of that platform. It's concerning. It's concerning, and unfortunately, I don't think things will change on that front until there are changes, of philosophy there, but other countries may begin to get stronger in those spaces with mRNA vaccines, which would put us at a disadvantage from a national security perspective. So I think it's a concerning change. I'm sure bio is doing what it can on this topic, but we're dealing with a set of views here that we all recognize are very firm, albeit misguided.
Yeah, John, can I just mention an interesting personal anecdote that is somewhat related to this? So my wife and we just had our second child about a month ago, and in the hospital, right, like when your child is born, right, they offer you the hepatitis B vaccine, and just the approach to offering that was different this time. I mean, we were checked on 3 times in sort of an "Are you sure?" dynamic, and you can almost get the sense that at the institution level, they're so worried about doing something that someone then freaks out about later. And I guess from a vaccine perspective, right, like this is just kind of a default medical decision generally in newborns. And then in talking to our pediatrician, she was so psyched that we'd actually done it because I'd been seeing a lot of families who hadn't. And like this is in Massachusetts, So and I have a control group, right, which is especially when my son was born almost 4 years ago. Like none of this in the acute setting was even remotely a dialogue, right? So I thought that was, again, it's a one-off thing, but it was just really interesting how you can see the attitude being so different 3 to 4 years later.
Well, there was a fascinating interview this past week between Matt Herper and Bill Gates, where Gates, has commented on even the global emergence of vaccine hesitancy and the implications of that on broader aspects of global public health. So yeah, this stuff has ripple effects that are profound and absolutely contradictory to ensuring a healthy society. Definitely far from Maha, I would say. So it is unfortunate, and Paul, what you're recounting there is really telling about a broader sentiment that's emerging and gaining a lot of traction, and not just here in the country, but globally. So it is a point of concern.
Yeah, love the personal anecdote, Paul. Thank you for sharing. I mean, I guess just one added comment for me is just the stark irony here. How we could change so much in 5 years. There was a press report out this week saying that Donald Trump had been nominated, I think, by Cambodia for a Nobel Peace Prize, and the basis, believe it or not, of that nomination was Operation Warp Speed and the terrific job that the Trump 1 administration had done to bring mRNA vaccines to the world on a record timeline and distribute them effectively and really change the course of the pandemic. And I believe that the Trump 1 administration deserves a lot of credit for that.
They do.
Yet somehow we got so wrapped around the axle politically, I guess,
Yeah.
politics just came in and completely took over this debate, which should always have been a scientific debate, and now made it such that we've got antagonizing sides on both sides of the aisle, and it's a battle zone. And the science, unfortunately, has taken a huge back seat in all of this. And I guess that's just a comment of what we're left with society today. I know there are a lot of scientists on this call and a lot of scientists listening in, and we can all just hope that we can get back to a day and age when science gets to lead and not follow the politics.
Well, maybe we need Laura Loomer to intervene here to sort of help educate the subversion of Trump 1.0 vis-a-vis Operation Warp Speed, because I do think, I'm joking, but I do think, Trump administration 1.0 deserves a huge amount of credit with OWS, and a big part of that was mRNA vaccines. So it does seem counter to a step forward that was materialized during that time and that crisis. So it's unfortunate.
Should we move on and talk about some company news? Maybe I can start with Vertex, and then Eric, you can do Agios, and then if we have time, I can do Praxis too. Does that sound good?
Let's do it.
Absolutely.
Okay. Just want to make sure everyone can hear me. Yeah. So this week, Vertex. There's a broader conversation here too about sort of love stocks, and I actually want to ask Eric after this just if he can think about analogs in this in the large cap biotech world. But for everyone on the call, I'm sure everyone knows Vertex well. But from an investor perspective, I mean, this has been a love stock for years now, based on just the perceived scarcity value of a company with a $10 billion plus drug franchise in cystic fibrosis that is very high margin with no real imminent competitors, and then separately a pipeline and doing real drug development and an impressive scientific team and a lot of different shots on goal. And so the most compelling shot on goal there has been their pain portfolio of sodium channel modulators, which in a dream case could be applicable to a wide array of pain etiologies with no real abuse potential because they work on the transmission of pain and not the physiological or neurological awareness of pain. The setback this week, though, is as the acute launch or the hospital launch for their drug, suzetrigine, not just in the hospital, but sort of a hospital outpatient care setting, has gone okay. It's gone decently, but it's slow. It's a market they have to build. They had a setback for their next generation pain product, which failed in a trial and was discontinued. And they also had a meeting with the FDA where they were trying to pursue a path in chronic pain to a broad indication for neuropathic pain. And the FDA basically said the door wasn't open for that on just kind of looking at a couple specific indications and generalizing. And I think the interesting sort of takeaways here are a few things. One, I actually feel like before these earnings, there wasn't really a lot of credit in Vertex's stock for that broad pain dynamic, just because one of the studies that was based on, LSR sciatica, actually failed, right? So this was a disappointment on the FDA feedback. On the other hand, though, the data was never actually that overwhelmingly positive that supported it in the first place, and investors knew that. The second piece is that this second generation drug that failed in acute, again, it's another thing where was there really anything explicit there in investors' models? Not totally clear, right? I mean, I think the debate around the acute product in pain was less about efficacy and more about just can you build that market. But I feel like this is a scenario of a company that has had this halo effect and has been remarkably resilient for a number of years, where they had this failure in alpha-1 antitrypsin deficiency, stock traded off a lot, really came back again on that scarcity value thesis, failure in pain last year and LSR sciatica. The stock went below $400, came back to almost the high 400s. And I think the interesting sort of conversation here is, when and how do these special companies kind of get that halo effect that buoys the stock removed, and what does it take? I mean, the other nuance here was that they did not raise their revenue guidance for the first time in multiple years, and they haven't done that in a second quarter call. So I think there's some concern that maybe the cystic fibrosis business is getting to a more predictable phase. But I've always kind of felt like the valuation with Vertex and, John, we'll talk about Alnylam, valuation with Alnylam to some degree, can be more subjective than other big cap companies because it's been one of the unique companies with this sort of feasible blue sky case. And when that kind of went away, I think more firmly on pain, you saw a much bigger reaction in the stock, down over 20% than I think almost anyone would have anticipated. And so it's an interesting situation here. There's nothing really imminent to reconcile it, but I'd love to get others' perspective either on Vertex or just, how we should kind of think about the implications for companies and stock sentiment in general.
Go ahead, John.
Eric, you should, you start, Eric.
No, please go.
Yeah, I was just going to say, Vertex is such a great company, but I think there's always a struggle when, I mean, they propelled obviously so remarkably on CF, and everybody wants to see Act Two, just like with Regeneron, obviously Eylea, but then Dupixent, and even there's been some pullback on Regeneron, and so investors just want to see that Act Two, Act Three that propels and fuels future growth. Once you get into these high valuations for these companies, because they're up there because of growth potential. That's true with Alnylam right now. They're soaring as it should because of prospects for growth with Amvuttra. So it does get challenging if you lose one of your your big winners, potential big winners, like people are fearing with the pain franchise.
Yeah, I don't have a ton to add here. And Paul, you're much closer to the sentiment and the stock dynamics on Vertex than I am. What's interesting actually is that both the pain franchise and the CF franchise originated from the same source within Vertex. I think, John, I know you're old enough to remember the acquisition they did back in 2001 of Aurora Biosciences,
Of course.
but that was where all these ion channels started. And wow, what a great acquisition that was! I think it was about a $600 million total
Yeah.
acquisition. They got the CF franchise, and boy, if you're looking for a halo effect, there's nothing better than a CF franchise. They're just so dominant in this space. It's hard to imagine that there's a more valuable franchise almost anywhere in biotech these days. And it's going to last a little bit longer, right? So the good news is there's no real urgency here at Vertex, but certainly they do need another act. And pain's tough. As much as we need new pain drugs, theirs don't seem to be that potent, Paul. I mean, I guess that's my read from all of this. Yes, we've seen failures before, but just doesn't seem like this mechanism packs the punch needed to really be a major player. And of course, we've seen pain launches before to know that they're very, very slow and gradual if they ever take off. So maybe, maybe this is a major transition point in Vertex's progress and strategy, and maybe they need to think about something else. I don't know.
Well, I think like what's really interesting with how they've worked on pain and, even some of the work they've done in other things like AAT, right, is, and you can't blame them for this, right, but they've really leveraged, in my view, like the cystic fibrosis approach, these sort of targeted proof of concept studies, betting on the science, betting on early successes that they're going to continue. And I'm biased, right? Because I've covered a lot of these small neuro companies, and I've been, on the wrong side of things that have blown up on incredible phase 2 data. I just feel like you can't do that in neurology. And if it were up to me, and caveat being, I've never developed a drug or got a drug approved. If I was running that program, there'd be 5 phase 2 studies ongoing right now across a whole array of different pain etiologies and migraine, and any indication that was advanced to phase 3 would have 3 studies only when we need 2, because I think that's just like the way you have to do things in neuroscience. I mean, Prozac's the poster child, right? One of the top selling antidepressants ever, failed in more trials than it worked in. And I don't think pain is any different. And so I do wonder if part of the setback was that, Vertex is, they deserve all the credit in the world for their innovation engine, but it feels like the CF philosophy was applied to a disease area where you just can't do that. Like the endpoints are really, really tough. There's no biomarkers. Patients are heterogeneous. And so, yeah, and I mean, now they're not quite back to the drawing board. They're in phase 3 in DPN, but it feels like the program itself could be revamped.
John, we can't leave this topic of valuable franchises without having you take a little bit of a victory lap on Alnylam and Amvuttra. So go ahead. I'll tee you up for you.
Yeah, I couldn't be there last week when, last hangout last Friday, which would have been more pertinent from a timing standpoint. But, it's just wonderful to see Alnylam report the second quarter results, and Amvuttra's on a rip. I mean, it's looking fantastic, and it's just at the beginning. So I'm super proud of the team there, and what they're doing, and where they're going. I have a tradition of opening up a nice bottle of champagne for every $50 Alnylam share price, and I managed to cover 2 bottles last week. So I'm still dragging a little bit this week as a result of it, but it's a real credit to the team over there, and so forth. Look, I think the interesting thing, it gets back to the Vertex story, and Regeneron as well. When companies cross a certain threshold value, it really is driven by a mega product or franchise opportunity, CF, Eylea, Dupixent, et cetera. And then, to really, for Alnylam to get to, the next horizon of 100 billion, which I expect it will, it'll require continued growth on Amvuttra, and then probably one other or 2 other major assets in the portfolio. Good news and the interesting thing for all these companies, Vertex maybe less so, but certainly for Regeneron and Alnylam, I mean, these are companies that are sporting their own innovation organically. They're largely doing it on their own, as opposed to getting it from the outside. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but it's an interesting feature of what these companies have done over the years. Which,
John,
yeah,
I would love to ask you a quick question. Someone covering Alnylam now who misses you as the CEO, even though I love the current team too. So the quarter was, unbelievable, right? I mean, it blew out the sell side consensus number. Maybe that wasn't a real number, but some people were pointing to a QVIA data that pointed to 420 million. It was so much more than that. If you're running Alnylam in that situation, how do you balance, conveying confidence going forward that this is not a one-off bolus of patients, but also you don't want the numbers and the expectations to get out of hand? Yeah, I just thought it was interesting. Like the team sounds, they sound so confident, and they should be confident. But would you be, if you were the still looking at the stock and thinking, I got to make sure this doesn't get out of hand and we don't set up for some arbitrary disappointment in 2 quarters when we beat consensus by 50 million, but we had to beat it by 90? Like, do you think that way when you're in that seat?
you do. I mean, you definitely try to dampen enthusiasm. I mean, if you have a blowaway quarter result, and and they certainly.
John, I think you muted yourself.
Brig. Hello. Yeah, I'm back. Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? Yeah. Jesus Christ. Hello.
Yes, we can hear you, John. John, we can hear you.
Okay. All right. Good. Sorry. Yeah. What I was saying is, you don't. I mean, I think the important thing to do here is not to let expectations get too far ahead and start creating new sets of estimates that are not going to be met. I think Alnylam is super savvy about that. Jeff Poulton, CFO, Paul, is really, really careful, and as is Yvonne. And so I'm sure that they'll do a good job, managing this trajectory. It's a great, wonderful event when you have a blowaway quarter, but you definitely want to make sure that it's sustainable, and obviously they have a line of sight on already quite a bit of Q3 performance. So I'm sure they have a good sense of where this is going.
Makes sense. Eric, do you want to talk about Agios at all?
Yeah, we could do that, or well, why don't we do it quickly? I don't know if you guys have been following the news earlier in the week. The stock was very volatile on Monday. In fact, at one point it was down over 20%. This on the heels of a sell side report that called out a potential link in the FAERS safety database that the FDA maintains. This gets updated on a quarterly basis, and in FAERS there were 4 patient reports of potential deaths linked to Pyrukynd. Pyrukind's approved for a small niche indication, PK deficiency, and it's in development, of course, for sickle cell disease. And multiple patient deaths were reported in PKD, and 1 death in sickle cell. And news of that report from sell-side analysts, again, just hammered the shares. Really caught, I think, the company off guard, scrambled to kind of find a response to this. And fortunately, their response was very, I would say, accurate in terms of trying to dispel the myth or the link between the FAERS deaths and their drug. Specifically, there weren't really 4 deaths; there were only 3, and all of those 3 deaths had seemingly no relation to the product itself. In each case, there was not thought to be a link between use of the product and the deaths. Of course, CF patients have high mortality anyway, and the PKD patients who died were very elderly or had underlying cancers to boot. So, this became a fire drill. Unfortunately, it was a pretty nasty fire drill. And maybe the lesson here, the worst part of all of this, was that the company wasn't only caught flat-footed with investors. We're big guys. We can stomach a day or two volatility, but I think it's certainly possible that this news leaked beyond the investment community into the patient community, where I know the company was aiming to be very diligent in its ability to address its most important constituents, those patients who have PKD and those patients who have sickle cell. It would have been terrible if something like this had persuaded patients to come off their drug prematurely or to be skeptical of product in the future. And I think sometimes the investment community doesn't think as much about the broader implications of what we might be writing. Paul, you're a sell-side analyst. I don't know if you might have handled this differently. I suspect you would have, but I think it's probably on all of us to think a little bit more carefully before we come up with conspiracy theories and make sure that we kick the tires pretty hard on anything like this or this nature that could be potentially so incendiary and potentially harmful to our greatest asset, which is the patients who have these conditions. Paul, can you hear me?
I can hear you, Eric. I don't know why. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. I can't now hear Paul. John, I'm not sure you were wrapped up in the fire drill that was Agios, but again, it's nice to see the stock recover and hopefully they're able to contain the broader issue too.
Yeah, no, I have been following it. I used to be on the board, and I'm glad things recovered as they did.
So maybe, I hope Paul's able to join. We can't hear you still, Paul. I see you're off speaker, but John, I know a company that you and I have followed for a number of years, decades. Now was also in the news in Biogen. They put out a release this week saying that they're going to start up a new venture arm, not necessarily for a straight return on investment, but maybe more for corporate purposes to get a little bit of a look under the hood. Maybe you want to walk our listeners through that and your thoughts.
I saw the news briefly, so I didn't go through all the details. So maybe you can have some of the details. Do you want to start there, and then I certainly can
Yeah, I
comment.
mean, I don't, yeah, I think that the details were, fairly plain vanilla.
Yeah.
I think what we've seen from Biogen is a greater interest in resourcing external innovation versus internal innovation. I know you can comment on that, but in terms of the venture group itself, they've been looking for assets from an in-licensing standpoint, from a BD standpoint now for some time under Chris Viehbacher's leadership. That was, I think, a meaningful change over the last 3 or 4 years. But this venture arm now will begin to invest in earlier stage companies and assets. And again, do so with an eye toward corporate priorities as opposed to return on capital priorities. I think really trying to align itself with Biogen's remaining internal drug discovery engine to try and get involved at an early stage in programs and products that the Biogen folks think are valuable.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. No, I thought, look, it's consistent with what I saw briefly too, Eric. I mean, I think Biogen is really going through a transformation. Chris has been leading it now for, about a couple of years, and obviously, had a lot of has a lot of things to turn around for sure, because he was left a bit of a redo, remake. In many ways, it's such a great company. I used to work there for a decade back in the 80s and 90s, so it's got a really, really warm place in my heart. And Chris and his research chief Jane Grogan, who is a terrific scientist, terrific leader. I mean, they got a lot of work to do. They know that, and they've been doing some collaborations with companies. I mean, they partnered with City Therapeutics, where I'm the exec chair, and it was really great to get them involved with that effort. They've been broadening out their effort beyond neurology to include immunology, which I think is smart. I think they, probably, historically they over indexed on the neurospace. Paul would be able to comment on that himself, but they over indexed in that space and made it more challenging for them to really grow as a business. But now they're going broader. So I've got and also rare disease. They're interested in augmenting their rare disease presence. So I think the venture side of it is a good move for them. Chris really gets the importance of new companies and the innovation ecosystem. I mean, he understands why larger companies can't succeed on some things that smaller companies can do. So this, I'm sure, is a nod to his own deep felt belief in all that. And he successfully did that at Sanofi with the venture investments they did there, including some really innovative ones like Warp Drive as well. And not everything's always going to work out, but some of them will. So I think it's not a surprise that a new venture fund has been created under Chris's leadership. But I'm looking forward to seeing how they can contribute to the ecosystem here, and maybe help support some new cutting edge companies in a very, very tough private market environment out there as well. So that's all good.
Paul, you able to rejoin us? I'm not sure we can hear you still. And John, just coming back to your comment, how Chris inherited a little bit of an organization, and
Now.
Yep.
Oh,
good.
yeah, no.
I don't. This room is like something's wrong with it today because my
It's
phone's
cursed.
totally
It's
fine,
cursed.
man, and I just had to leave and rejoin. I mean, Biogen, like, I think, yeah. So I agree with everything you guys said. I mean, I feel like Biogen is like one of your things you sent around, Eric, is like, how do they get here? It feels like it was like a combination of strategy and capital allocation years ago and bad luck. And I say bad luck because I must have like sat on, I don't know, 75 doc calls on Alzheimer's in the past 10 years more. Like there were one-off physicians who said the A beta antibodies would get narrow use. Everyone else was saying, oh my God, if we had something for these patients, they'd be used more broadly. So I just feel like, I can understand why they allocated billions of capital to those projects. Like the commercial upside always surveyed like it was there. And I don't think anyone anticipated how hard it would be. Maybe they should have, but like I feel like it's not fair to say in hindsight that this was obvious that these drugs would be niche, right? I understand the benefit is not huge, but like no one really thought you needed a huge benefit to have a big drug in Alzheimer's. And then like I think under the prior board, right, there was maybe a different view of just valuation and M&A, and they were a lot more conservative, and they watched a lot of good neuroscience stuff get a lot more expensive over the years, like companies like Neurocrine and Acadia and the muscarinic companies. And so I think, I mean, I like Chris. Like I think he's done a nice job. I think like a lot of investors I think fixate on like a deal, right? Like the Riata deal, like was that an overpay or not? But it feels like he's doing the right things, trying to diversify the therapeutic area mix, and I think he has like a keen understanding on what they lack and what they need.
Yeah,
John,
I agree.
I'd be curious, John, just, again, having watched this company over decades now and having spent time there yourself when it was such a scientific powerhouse. I guess Biogen's one of the companies that failed to innovate beyond its very robust and very successful MS first generation franchise, and never developed that second act. Do you think it's luck or bad luck, or do you think maybe something went wrong along the way?
Well, I think look, I think historically the company has been challenged with deal making. And I think that MS was amazing, and they hit it out of the park, and obviously built the company with MS. But there's just going back all the way back to Jim Vincent, Eric. There's just a very high level of reluctance to do deals in general. Very conservative approach. I had dinner with Adam Koppel earlier this week, who used to run corporate development at Biogen, and Adam was joking about, or I was actually teasing him about Neurocrine, and where that unfortunate deal that could have been a good deal for them never materialized. And a lot of it's related to the sort of historical board at Biogen, which Chris is changing. Chris has been changing. So look, I think Chris is going to right the ship. It's going to take some time. It's just going to take some time. It's super tough when you've got a basis of billions of revenues that aren't growing, and you got to reinvigorate, reignite growth in that it's going to take a few years, or hopefully not a few years, but it's going to take more than the time that he's been there so far. But I'm optimistic that there'll be a path forward for them.
Hey, can I chime in real quick? Because I want to hear Eric's perspective on something, and then John, like it would be a lost opportunity not to hear your perspective. This report from the Financial Times on Avidity and Avidity might be in play. I mean, Eric, I cover Dyne, you cover Avidity. I mean, I think you probably agree with me that these transferrin oligoconjugates are one of the more interesting, innovative areas in small biotech with, a few indications that are big white space. I was curious though, are you surprised by the timing? Because, FSHD, their data's great, right? But there's still some questions around, I think, the phase 3 design and some of the regulatory dynamics. And in DM1, I mean, I think, DM1 like is not without, for either company, some level of clinical and regulatory risk. So doesn't surprise me at all that these companies would be in play. They seem prime takeout targets at some point in their life cycle, but it was earlier than I thought.
Yeah,
I mean,
I think. Oh, go ahead, John.
yeah, I would. No, go ahead.
You're the RNAi guy. Yep.
No, sure. Yeah, no, I mean, look, I think Novartis has got a, let me just maybe provide some context here. I mean, Novartis is on a tear with RNAi, right? They made the Medco acquisition back 9.7 billion in 2019. They or 18, DTX was bought a couple years ago. They've done some deals out of China in RNAi. They bought Regulus. So they're big believers in the space, and it wouldn't surprise me that Voz, now it's a rumor, so we don't know for sure, but it wouldn't surprise me if Voz saw this as something he wanted to grab ahead of news that might make it a lot more expensive. And it's certainly a good way for the Avidity shareholders and board to balance the risk reward here in terms of the readouts that they've got coming forward. But Eric, what do you think?
Well, like you, John, I guess I don't know what to think in terms of some
Yeah.
standability of these rumors, but well, honestly, I hope they're not true. And the reason I do is I'm a huge believer, maybe like Paul, in the power of this platform, the ability to deliver RNAi to muscle, and not just skeletal muscle, as we're seeing potentially transform these diseases in real time, FSHD, DMD, DM1, but also potentially smooth muscle, cardiac muscle as well. So, Paul, I think like you, we do share the view that Dyne and Avidity could grow up to be the next Alnylam or the next Vertex, really important company in our space, right? And if there is a deal to be had, boy, I hope it's a huge premium, because I think there's a lot of value in these businesses.
Yeah,
I agree with that.
Yeah, I mean, there's just very few. When you look at FSHD and DM1, and DMD is still pretty open too. I mean, there's just not that many rare disease markets like that are just white space. Like, there's just not that many, right? That could actually really move the needle for a company like Novartis. So, it'd be super interesting to watch it play out.